Hello and welcome to my channel. My name is David Novak. I have gotten past the midpoint of The Silk Roads by Peter Frankopan. It's taken me longer than I would have wished, though I am beginning to read a little bit faster, as is customary for me. The opening chapters of a book tend to be harder for me to make it through, and as I become accustomed to the ideas, even the manner of presentation, then I tend to speed up a little bit. I'm still by no means breezing through it, and I will be in the world of Mr. Frankopan longer than I would necessarily like or have anticipated. But that said, I am liking the book much more than I did at the beginning. I'm still not enamored with Frankopan's writing style. I don't like it very much. But I've passed the phase where I am marking up my book with underlines and circles and little question marks and comments for all of the persnickety details of phraseology that bugged me. I find that as the text has progressed, Frankopan has moved into his subject. Perhaps the initial pages were meant as sort of a prelude, and he was not really in his wheelhouse, as is said these days. So I'm liking it more. And another aspect of it that I like is that we're moving into territory where my ignorance looms so large that I find he does a marvelous job of summarizing and filling in gaps for me. So I give Frankopan credit for really assimilating an awful lot of information. Now, having said that, I don't believe the book is really about the Silk Roads. It's a fairly conventional Western viewpoint on the growth of global trade networks, if you will. In my video where I was really going into all of these persnickety details, I said he should have called it the silk arteries, because he was using the word arteries too much. Well, he stopped doing that. It's really not a feature of the book. He did not do that thereafter. It would, however, actually be a pretty good title, because he really is not talking about, well, get rid of the word silk and just call it the arteries, perhaps, or the trade arteries, because that's more his subject. So at the point we're at, and I have to enunciate that he is clarifying for me things that I know vaguely about, but he's really giving me a clear idea in my mind. So we're at a stage where you've had the great voyages by Columbus and Vasco da Gama, and the world is pretty much divided between the Spanish and the Portuguese, with agreements to that effect. And so other powers, other European powers, are kind of uneasy with this term of things, or this status quo, and are trying to effect some change. And I knew nothing about the Dutch under the Spanish. He fills that in for me. All of a sudden, I feel like I know everything there is to know. Of course, I don't. But it's real helpful, and I think it's going to be a further help as he gets into the English in understanding the transition from the days of, say, Spanish/Portuguese dominance into the world of the great British Empire, which we are all just coming off of. I was born in the 60s, so probably around the time that the last of the great independence movements occurred in former British colonies. So that transitional period is something I need to learn about, and I trust Frankopan will give me a good idea on that. Now, it has provoked thoughts in me, and I've really come to the realization one reason not to regret reading a book like this is simply that in reading history, no book that you ever read is the last word. And just for show and tell, I brought out Michael Grant's The Rise of the Greeks. It cost me $1. There was a time when all of his books were showing up now and again for $1 in hardback editions, and I would pick them up. And before you start reading history, you get a book like this and you think, well, that's it. Now I know what there is to know. And it's absolutely not the case at all. Perhaps I will go into that in a little more detail after I read a segment from this. The last video or short video that I posted had me reading something about European warfare. The cat knocked over that the cat knocked over that camera, and I decided to let it stand because I figured people will prefer the cat to my yammering. Well, I am now in a position where the cat will not be knocking over the camera, and I'm going to give you about a page worth of yammering from Peter Frankopan's book. If you have this edition, you can find the quoted material on page 251 running over into 252. And I am not going to change any of Frankopan's words, but I'm going to make some ellipses, which I will not denote by saying ... as is my wont, because I find that kind of annoying to listen to a ... So I will just silently skip over a word here and half of a paragraph there. And if you want to get the full thing, as I say, I refer you to the book itself, page 251, 252. Europe's distinctive character as more aggressive, more unstable. Oh, I should have said this comes at the page following that last video, and it also deals with the topic of European violence, which I think is really a subject that needs mentioning. You may not need to go into a whole psychology of it, but I think it's an aspect of the history that you would not have gotten in a previous history. I mean, a history written years ago. You know, I have one here that I read years ago. This was my first introduction into the age of exploration, and it was a marvelous book, but I think it would be even more marvelous to reread it now after having read Frankopan. I don't think people who are educated can really understand how tough it is to get to any kind of level of understanding with information when you are coming from a state of abject ignorance. This is part of a whole series edited by J.H. Plum. He was quite a figure in his day. And I read the George Holmes on the Renaissance, and I really like George Holmes. I went on to read other books by Holmes. I collected what I could of the other volumes in this series, but never went into them. May never do so. But old history is not necessarily bad history, and I'm sure under the editorship of Mr. Plum, everything was well written. So there's that. Now, I'm going to read about a page, and I will not, as I say, denote my ellipses, but you can look that up. Europe's distinctive character as more aggressive, more unstable, and less peace-minded than other parts of the world paid off. After all, this was why the great vessels of the Spanish and the Portuguese had proved successful in crossing the oceans and connecting continents together. The traditionally built craft that had sailed across the Indian and Arabian seas for centuries with little change to their design were no match for Western vessels that could outmaneuver and outgun them at will. The same was true of military technology. Such was the reliability and accuracy of arms used in the Americas that small numbers of conquistadors were able to dominate populations that were vastly superior numerically, and populations that were advanced and highly sophisticated, except when it came to weapons. These were not the savages described by triumphalists in Europe. In fact, they seemed positively enlightened in comparison to the highly stratified societies that had emerged throughout most of the continent, where the gap between the powerful and the weak was cemented in an aristocratic patrimony that protected the social position of the powerful. Although Europeans might have thought that they were discovering primitive civilizations and that this was why they could dominate them, the truth was that it was the relentless advances in weapons, warfare, and tactics that laid the basis for the success of the West. One reason why the domination of Africa, Asia, and the Americas was possible was the centuries of European practice in building fortifications that were all but impregnable. Castle building had been the staple of European society since the Middle Ages, with thousands of spectacular strongholds springing up across the continent. Their purpose, of course, was to withstand heavy and determined attack. Their extraordinary number was testimony to the fear and regularity of assault. Europeans were world leaders in building fortresses and in storming them. It was striking how the European insistence on constructing imposing sites that could be secured from the inside was a source of bemusement to locals. No other traders had built forts in the past, noted the Nawab of Bengal in the 1700s. So why on earth did the Europeans insist on doing so now? The great irony then was that although Europe experienced a glorious golden age, producing flourishing art and literature and leaps of scientific endeavor, it was forged by violence. Not only that, but the discovery of new worlds served to make European society more unstable. I will leave my excerpt there, so you'll note that I began with something of the word unstable. Europe's distinctive character as more aggressive, more unstable, and less peace-minded than other parts of the world. and ended with the fact of European violence abroad having repercussions at home. And this, of course, is obvious as well if you study, say, the case of the French in Algeria, and then you look back to what was happening in Paris at the time that they were trying to clamp down and were torturing all those people and so forth. It cannot but have bleeds back home. This love affair with the gun, which is so pronounced in my country, has deep roots. And it seems to be a problem that nobody is able to deal with because there is strong opposition to dealing with it. And I think, just for the record, given that we have recently had a active shooting incident in Maine, some guy who went and shot up people in a bowling alley and a bar, I think, with 18 deaths so far, many others wounded, and many lives completely destroyed by this. And then, given the prevalence of this kind of incident in America, and then given other situations globally, I think it should be said that people who love guns have something wrong with them. There is something wrong with loving guns. In my country, of course, that kind of strange love can also be extended to loving cars. People who love their cars, there's something wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with liking fine workmanship, but guns and cars are tools. They're used for particular purposes, and that's it. They should be regarded as such. I remember a friend who went in the military, and early on in training, somebody pointed a gun at somebody, and it was made clear by whoever was training them that one thing you never do, ever, under any circumstance, is pointing a gun at somebody. You never point a gun at somebody. We have lost sight of that basic fact. I don't know how much blame can be placed with, say, Hollywood for that, with all of the guns a-blazing scenes, and for that matter, all of the wild car chases. Here in my city, they put speed bumps all over the place, which can be problematic in their own right, just because people don't care to drive at the speed limit. Obviously, the correct solution would be, why not just teach people how to drive better, how to respect the laws? And with guns, it would be something similar. Legislate and then teach people. But that's it. I don't want to go into a rant about that. I'm trying to talk about this book. And I think that what Frankopan says in the paragraphs that I just read really deserves to be spoken, and it's an element which cannot be excluded from history. And he kind of misses it. I think he begins with Alexander and still presents something of a sort of heroic view of Alexander. In the wake of Alexander, it seems that historians and political figures have sort of fallen over each other trying to come up with ways to praise Alexander. And you have to realize that that is not everybody's viewpoint. I am thinking of a video that I remember seeing of Sadhguru, which you can probably, I'll put it in the description if I can find it, about Alexander the Great Idiot. You have Alexander and his men going around with their blades and coming upon these people and just off with their heads. And he's a great person for that. And I think when Frankopan talks about the conquistadors demolishing these societies of greater sophistication, that can equally be applied to Alexander very much. The story of the Gordian knot, they have this knot, and he comes with his sword and just cuts the thing in half. That's exactly an example of the Western initiative to just destroy culture and get answers through violence. And it is this strain in human psychology that is going to do us in unless something can be done about it. I personally don't have a lot of hopes. Now, I want to read a little something else if I can find it. You know, I mark these things. Maybe I will cut out a little bit while I'm searching for it. Okay. Earlier in the chapter, well, actually in the previous chapter, Frankopan writes about Babur. First, he made himself master of Kabul. He was a descendant from Genghis Khan through Tamerlane, some generations. First, he made himself master of Kabul and then took control of Delhi by expelling the tyrannical Lodi dynasty, whose members were wildly unpopular thanks to their regular and savage persecutions of the Hindu population. Babur had already shown himself to be a keen builder, taking pleasure in setting out the magnificent garden of the Bagh-e-Wafa in Kabul with impressive fountains, pomegranate trees, clover meadows, orange groves, and plants brought from far and wide. When the oranges turn yellow, he wrote proudly, it is a beautiful sight, really handsomely laid out. As he established himself in India, he carried on with his glorious garden designs, despite complaining about the difficulties of the terrain. He was dismayed that water supply was such a problem in the north of the Indian subcontinent. Everywhere I looked, he wrote with horror, was so unpleasant and desolate that it was hardly worth the effort of trying to create something special. Eventually, he steeled himself, settling on a site near Agra. Although there was no really suitable place near the city, there was nothing to do but work with the space we had. Eventually, after considerable effort and great expense in unpleasant and inharmonious India, splendid gardens were created. Despite Babur's initial misgivings, the timing of his move south could not have been better. It did not take long for the new domain to turn into a mighty empire. So this is a case of just stumbling into empire, as we know from the Romans, as we know from the British. You just happen to fall into empire just because. So because he ejected the wildly unpopular Lodi dynasty, you get the sense that he is just here to get rid of those evil people and build magnificent gardens. This is not a book about building of gardens. And this is the thing that Frankopan does. He just pads out the text with these chunks of detail here and there. You even get a sense that Genghis Khan was kind of a chipper fellow. Well, I'll put another link to another Sadhguru video where he specifically goes into Babur's 4 years in Delhi, involving matters that are completely unmentioned in the Silk Roads. And that's what I mean by this retaining its thoroughly Western viewpoint. I'm not going to say that this viewpoint or that viewpoint is correct. That's one of the difficulties with history, if you will. There are opposing views or just discordant views on events which happened. And so when you read one book, what did I hold up? The Rise of the Greeks, you have not answered anything. You have raised more questions. So I will leave that there. I will just show you, since I pulled them out, a few other of my books about the ancient Greeks. This, of course, would have been where I started from. And it's a magnificent book, a magnificent introduction to the Greeks, but it's very, very specific. You've got classical Athens, and that's about it. But it's a very nice introduction to all the different inventions, if you will, by the Greeks. And these I don't remember quite so well, but they're just all of them lovely examples of these old pelicans. And then trying to get into the origins of the Greeks is a book that I need to reread. I actually need to do a thorough rereading of his books. He has one starting with the Bronze Age, then he moves into this, and then all of his subsequent books about horses, and then about Indo-European, I'm not even sure what that last book is about, violence / dominance / horsemanship. I still don't understand what I read, but he is a magnificent writer, and reading his set of books in sequence, beginning with the one on Bronze Age, the end of the Bronze Age, I think, then the coming of the... Well, let me just go get them and see what I can... Pardon me. I'll just show you my books by Drews. So the end of the Bronze Age is very good. Then you get the coming of the Greeks. He has a handful of books which are much older than this. He is currently a very old man, and I am hoping still an active scholar with another book or books forthcoming. And then the next one was about early writers. This I never expected to get something like this when I ordered it. Look at the inside. Look at these margins. I wish somebody could cut this down for me and make it a normal size, but the origins of writing are not so clear, and he continues that in his most recent book, Militarism and the Indo-Europeanizing of Europe. And it is a masterful book that you will read and not understand if you are anything like me. But when I was last year reading The Dawn of Everything by Graeber and Winslow, this was the book that I kept thinking of because his scholarship is meticulous and there is some overlap between those two books. So I highly recommend this, but you probably need to go into the books in order if you're very, very much a novice like I am. I'm just trying to see if I can find any of the illustrations of the... Yeah, here's some stuff, some of the bits. Jointed snuffle bits. Pardon me, snaffle bits. And here is a severe jointed snaffle bit. So this, of course, brings into question all of our relationships with the animal kingdom as well, and what we have become or allowed ourselves to become, although what we became quite early in our human evolution. So I've shown you Drew's. Here's a book about the Greeks that I've never looked at. What was it, $1? Something like that, $2. Just to reinforce the idea, which is really solidifying itself with me now, or calcifying, coalescing, that might be the word, in my brain, that no book of history will ever give you the last word. And so when it comes to reading Frankopan, I've moved on from being, I guess, kicking and cursing against Frankopan to just wishing that it was a little bit smoother. I don't believe it's really about the Silk Roads. It's more about a history of the world, say along the lines of that old H.G. Wells book, which was probably an interest of mine because that's a book I read as a very young man and got nothing out of. Obviously superseded, but still probably worth looking at if you are a better reader than I am. I will leave it there. Thank you very much for stopping by my channel.